Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Be Bold America. I'm your host, Jill Cody. And I'm sorry to say that Pettis isn't feeling well, so he won't be joining us today. Pettis, we miss you and we hope you feel better soon. Our program today is, Can We Take the Heat? The impacts of the climate crisis have become dire. Rising temperatures, volatile weather, and poor air quality affect our physical and mental health in dangerous new ways. From increasing the risk of infectious disease to amplifying emotional stress and anxiety, even the healthiest among us are at risk. As some of you are aware, I was editor and contributor to a book called Climate Abandoned, We're on the Endangered Species List. It is an anthology of experts who were selected and who completed Vice President Al Gore's and Inconvenient Truth trainings. I bring this up to acknowledge the two experts on the topic of the climate crisis and health that was included in that book. One chapter was written by Dr. Kasper Eplov from Sweden, who took the MD's perspective, and another chapter was written by Cindy Martinez in Missouri, who took the nurse's perspective. And for this Earth Day weekend, we're going to delve more deeply into this topic with Peabody award-winning journalist Bonnie Schneider. The relationship between health and the climate crisis isn't talked about enough. Since it affects all of us one way or the other, and will do so for years to come, we must talk about it a lot more. Our future depends on it. And we have a special someone to start that conversation. Our bold guest today is Bonnie Schneider. Bonnie is a national television meteorologist and Peabody award-winning journalist based in New York City who appears on MSNBC, NBC News, Yahoo Finance, and provides on-camera insight and expertise on CNN, HLN, Bloomberg TV, and the Weather Channel. Bonnie Schneider is also the author of Taking the Heat, How Climate Change is Affecting Your Mind, Body, and Spirit, and What You Can Do About It. And she's founder of Weather and Wellness, a platform that explores the connection between weather, climate change, and health. In her new book, Taking the Heat, Bonnie provides crucial advice from science experts and medical professions to help who? You. We have big things to do. Welcome to Be Bold America, Bonnie. It is an honor to have you on the program.
Thank you, Jill. It's so great to be with you.
Well, it is our pleasure. And Bonnie, you have written a brilliant book. It is easy to read. It isn't scary, as many books about the climate emergency are, and provides very real and tangible actions one can do depending on the problem, from allergies to wildfire smoke, as we have been suffering here in California for many years. To kick things off, Bonnie, you begin your book by saying, quote, the human body has a natural way to manage heat. Since our climate is heating up, what happens when this instinctive process doesn't work?
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of us take for granted that when we're in a hot environment, our body knows what to do, that it will perspire and moisture will be released into the air and will cool down. But when you're in a situation where, let's say, it's very oppressive in the humidity, your body cannot release the heat and the sweat cannot evaporate. And I think we've all experienced that in some scale, being in a hot environment. But when you're in a very seriously hot environment and you can't sweat to cool down, then you could have serious problems, and that could lead to heat-related illness, and in its worst form, something very severe, including heat stroke, and that's when the body just begins to shut down because the heat is so oppressive. Now, this is the worst-case scenario, but even on a milder scale, to suffer from heat-related illness is very serious. And, in terms of meteorology and weather, heat is the leading killer. And I think people don't realize that. They might think, well, it's tornadoes or hurricanes, but it's actually heat.
Wow,
heat
I didn't know that either. Yeah.
Slow moving. You can't feel it or see it necessarily right away when it starts, but it affects people in a very severe way. And that's one of the aspects of the book I wrote about.
Now, how do you define excessive heat? What is that?
Well, there's meteorological terms in terms of how you would define a heat wave, and that has to do with the temperature exceeding a certain threshold for, let's say, for 3 days. But what I found was interesting in the book, and I think that you could probably relate to this in California, is that in recent years, many places that weren't necessarily known for extreme heat were experiencing it. So let's say north of you into places like Oregon and Washington, where people that don't have air conditioners, I'm sure for years maybe they thought they didn't need it. But we've seen these heat waves happening in areas where it is typically on the cooler side and you don't get that experience of heat. So I just think it's been more widespread and in recent years and more people are aware of it.
You are so right. I live on the coast, and none of the houses have air conditioning. Mm-hmm. When they were built, it wasn't thought they needed them, and yet we have had some very high temperatures right on the coast. And also the whole California, Oregon, Washington had what was called a heat dome. Mm-hmm. I guess that just covered the all three states and maybe even more. And wouldn't let it cool down. So we've had those problems too. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one of the other issues that I'm glad that you brought that up is that we've not only seen rising temperatures during the day, but we've seen them at night. So we've had a record warm, low temperatures. And when you don't have that reprieve from the heat at night, especially in cities, that's when it gets really dangerous.
Well, you talk about our environment can be healing or harmful. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I can. I think it can be healing in a way that connecting with nature, for example, it can be very healing for our mental health. That's something I write about in my book for people that are dealing with eco-anxiety. And it can be the situation where, let's say, young people in particular are very scared and anxious about the future due to climate change, or people that are suffering from post-traumatic stress due to surviving a natural disaster, or just going through like a wildfire event. They might find that connecting with nature is healing, and it's trusting nature again can be healing. But in terms of it being harmful, poor air quality, we mentioned heat, and the rising exposure to different various infectious diseases, all of this can relate to a warming planet.
Well, you talked about eco-anxiety, and that I think is one of your first chapters in the book. Tell us what that is.
Well, Jill, many people have the fear of what's going to happen if action isn't taken and we don't reduce emissions.
Yeah, I have that fear.
Exactly. So what I found was widespread was the younger generation, Gen Z. There just was a study, it was published in The Lancet, where they interviewed 10,000 young people from ages 16 to, I think, 24, and it was over 70% of them were very concerned about climate change. And it's what happens is that it goes from this fear and concern can develop into anxiety. And I interviewed people that are experiencing this, and psychiatrists and psychologists that have been treating it. So it manifests in very real symptoms like losing sleep and having racing thoughts about it. It's not something that people should take lightly. For those that are suffering from eco-anxiety, it's a very tough thing to deal with.
Well, and it's fear of the future, not knowing whether we're going to get our act together enough. I understand the problem is really bigger than any individual can do right now. We need governmental and countries joining together at a much better pace than we've been going. Is that your assessment too?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I've been connected with groups like the Climate Psychology Alliance and Climate Psychiatry Alliance that are getting medical professionals together from all over the country because they are in the front lines and they've been seeing how climate change has been affecting their own patients' health in various ways. Or let's say the diagnosis of a disease. I write about this in the book. In Massachusetts, someone had encephalitis that was related to a mosquito bite. And that's not something that you would necessarily see in that part of the country typically. So as people tell their own firsthand stories, I think that the information is getting out there. And this book that I wrote was a way to reach the public, was a way to reach people, like you said, but without being too scary, making those aware of these risks and also actions they can take to mitigate the risk.
Well, many years ago, maybe 10, 12 years ago, I facilitated a meeting in Prague in the Czech Republic, and it was in the University of St. Charles University, which was built when that when the Czech Republic was part of Russia. So it was very utilitarian, and it didn't have any air conditioning. And Europe at that time was having a huge heat wave. And I was facilitating the meeting. I was facilitating the whole conference. People were there from all around the world. And there was no air conditioning anywhere. And I'm up in front of the room. I could feel the sweat, or my mother would say the glowing, running down my back. And the pressure that I felt to just maintain my edge and to lead a meeting, to make sure everything's working properly, was very difficult. And that's what happens too when you're hot. Your mind doesn't work as well. At least that was my experience, right?
Yeah, and there's actually a science behind that, because in one of the chapters of my book, it's called Heat, Sleep, and Memory, and I interviewed a researcher at Harvard who did a fascinating study where college students during the summer in Boston, half were sleeping in an air-conditioned dorm and half were in an older building that had no air conditioning. And studies on cognition had been done before with older people and heat, but not with people that are healthy 19, 20-year-olds. And what they found was it doesn't matter about your age. If you are in a hot environment and you can't fall asleep because of the heat, the next day your memory and your cognitive performance is affected. So the researcher that I spoke to said that he was even surprised how much it affected even these healthy young people in terms of how they could recall information the next day and how they performed.
So this is important to know, whether you're going to school and needing to study and pay attention to a lecture, or in the workplace.
Absolutely. I think most of America has air conditioning, but not all. And one of the things with climate change is even in places that we're familiar with heat, like, let's say, in Arizona or in Florida or in Texas, even these areas are warmer in many locations than they were before. So heat is still an ongoing issue. And in the book, I talk about people that are more vulnerable to heat-related illness, for example, the elderly, or people that are living in low-income areas and minorities. Throughout the book, I talk about the different areas and how they're affected. And if you're wondering why that is, for the first example, I mentioned senior citizens, and that's because their bodies aren't as efficient in terms of expelling heat and cooling down. They could also be on certain medications that are affected by heat. And for those that are in low-income communities and often minorities, unfortunately, some of the poorest parts of cities have the least amount of trees, and that's also been backed up by science and research. And trees are a natural cooling mechanism that can reduce the temperature and shade by 20 degrees. So if you're in a highly concrete area that doesn't have tree canopy, it can make a difference in terms of the exposure to heat.
It'll make a huge difference, because I did work for the city of San Jose as a senior manager years ago, and we started a urban forestry program and just kept planting trees more and more in the urban environment. And it's just not only the shade and the cooling on the buildings, but also the CO2 absorption as well.
Absolutely.
And
it makes a big difference.
It makes a big difference. So if your city isn't doing an urban forestry program, that could be something you could go to your city council and talk about. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the ksqd.org website. We're speaking with Bonnie Schneider. Bonnie is a national television meteorologist and Peabody Award-winning journalist based in New York City, author of Taking the Heat, and founder of Weather and Wellness. And Bonnie's site on Weather and Wellness has more on eco-anxiety and videos as well. So visit weatherandwellness.com. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Hello, K-Squid listeners. I'm Tom Hartman, and each weekday at 4 p.m., I bring you a different perspective on the news than you're likely to hear on most media outlets. Please join me on KSQD Santa Cruz, your ink spot on the dial for the Tom Hartman program, heard now for the first time ever in the Monterey Bay area at 90.7 FM, weekdays at 4 p.m. That's Progressive Talking Conversation with me, Tom Hartman, weekdays at 4 p.m. on KSQD 90.7 FM. Tag, you're it.
If you're just joining us, our topic is, Can We Take the Heat? And we're speaking with Bonnie Schneider, author of Taking the Heat and founder of Weather and Wellness. Visit weatherandwellness.com. And also find Bonnie on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. So, Bonnie, we live on the coast, most of us, except for maybe podcast people, and it's heard around the world. But those that live on the coast, you've talked about an illness that I'd never heard of. Is it Vibrio-associated illness or Vibrio? Vibrio-associated illnesses. What are those?
Well, they're very scary, Jill, because Vibrio bacteria, for example, it can seep into your skin through an open wound or a cut, something even a small cut, and it's found in what's known as brackish waters. So it's not everywhere, but what I found is that people that have been affected by this, if they had, as I mentioned, an entry point for the Vibrio bacteria to enter their bloodstream, unfortunately, it can lead to very, very serious health consequences where people could lose a limb or lose their life within a day or two. And I interviewed a family that unfortunately experienced that with loss in waters and on a beautiful beach day, and it was such a tragedy. So Vibrios are also consumed, can be consumed through contaminated seafood as well. The expert that I interviewed on this topic was a professor in South Carolina who's been studying this for decades, and he has said that the Vibrios have been spreading in further north than they did before, and then has to do with warmer water temperatures. So it's important to know your risk. And in the book, I explain about the seafood aspect of it and some of the signs to look for before you get into the water.
Well, let's delve into that a little bit more. How can you determine if you're eating seafood that's been contaminated? Go out to restaurants, or you have it in frozen foods or prepared foods?
Well, most places, especially food manufacturers, are monitoring that. But I think the greater risk comes from certain raw seafood that you could be eating. So that's where the risk lies. But, I get into the details more in the book about do's and don'ts and things like that with seafood. But I just think it's interesting because in the Northeast, for example, there were Vibrios, and I noticed this within the past 5 years. You'd hear someone describing something like flesh-eating bacteria in a lake, and it would be in an area where you wouldn't expect it to happen, and a lot of that has to do with the spread of warmer water temperatures at more northern latitudes, and that's kind of a theme throughout the book, because when you're having more heat and warmth in an extended period of time in areas that didn't have it before, it can lead to a host of exposure to a lot of different disease.
Well, a lot of people don't know that Siberia has had wildfires. The warmth is definitely moving north more, and I guess to sum up about the Vibrio-associated illnesses is don't go in water with an open wound. Would that be one of the major things?
Well, I wouldn't say don't go in any water in the ocean, but right, because otherwise nobody would go in the ocean. But I think it's just being aware of the potential for bacteria in the water, maybe doing a little research where you're swimming, because it's certain types of water that these bacteria can develop in, not all types of water. So I think it's a matter of being aware. It's interesting because 10 years ago I wrote a book called Extreme Weather, which was preparing for natural disasters. And in that book, I wrote about the danger of rip currents. And people that were caught up in that, and a lot of it would happen where somebody would go and not be aware that there was that danger at the beach. So it's not like you're going to see a sign that says there's Vibrios in the water, but I think just having awareness of dangers, just like when we go into the woods, being aware that Lyme disease can happen. You can get bit by a tick in your backyard or wherever you go, and to check for ticks when you take your clothes off and make sure that you weren't get bitten by a tick. Things that we didn't think of, let's say, at least I know I didn't a decade or two ago, that now should be top of mind when we're spending time in nature.
I think that's a really good analogy to going in the forest with Lyme disease or walking through grasses and getting ticks. We're aware of that now. We've known the Lyme disease moving across the country, and made it to California, but I just never heard of the Vibrio illnesses. And I think, as you said, we need to be a little bit more aware of where we're visiting and what beaches we're going to and what might be in the water there. And while we're on infectious diseases, you have written in your book about viruses and infectious diseases. What are some of them that are getting stronger with the climate crisis? Ones that we might want to know more about, like the Vibrio.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wrote quite a bit on Lyme disease. It was fascinating. I interviewed a young Canadian young athlete, and he was also not aware of the risk of Lyme disease. And the problem with Lyme disease is that it's often tough to diagnose, and the key to successful treatment is getting diagnosed as soon as possible and getting it treated as soon as possible. And the young man that I interviewed, it took 5 years to get the diagnosis of Lyme disease. So know that Lyme disease can happen anywhere in the country. There's been cases reported everywhere. It's not just in one part of the country. And because we have that longer, warm, extended period, longer summer and earlier spring, there is greater risk for that. So that's known as a vector-borne disease. The others I speak of, that one through ticks, but I also in the book talk about mosquitoes quite a bit, because mosquitoes can transmit Zika virus or West Nile virus, and these are also, unfortunately, infectious diseases that have become more widespread in a variety of areas. And climate change does increase exposure to these infectious diseases in many different ways. It's not just warm temperatures, but it's also through development. If we're developing, let's say, communities and getting rid of natural ecosystems and habitats, you're disrupting that. And what that does, let's say if you're clearing out an area, the predatory animals are gone. So what remains, let's say, are the fleas and the I don't say critters, but the creatures that would actually carry disease. So the more we develop land, the more that it actually can affect our health. It's not something, again, that we would think about, but there is a direct connection to disrupting nature. One of the things I also talk about are these types of vacations where people are having these nature vacations, but they want to, let's say, go into the rainforest or do something where they're really in contact with nature. But any type of human disturbance to a natural habitat can be disruptive for the animals.
Well, and we're also living in a very dog-friendly area, and you bring your dog to the forest, you bring your dog to the meadows and to the beach. And so tell us a little bit about pets, too, and how we protect ourselves, because they could carry something into the house.
That's true, especially with ticks. And I think that veterinarians talk a lot about that. And I didn't do as much of that in this book, but I have in I think on my website, weatherandwellness.com, I have a video with, I think she actually was California veterinarian.
Yes,
that's right.
you do.
I just remember that when I said it. So she talked about that. You know, it's interesting because I had asked her about the time during COVID. Many people were concerned, what if my pet gets this disease, and would I transmit it to my dog or cat? And then she was answering questions about that, which was pretty interesting as well. But I think it's the same thing where you're just checking your risk of checking your animal for any kind of bite or any behavior that seems out of the ordinary. Animals are at risk too, unfortunately, for a lot of these diseases.
Well, and while we're on the subject of that type of health, what are some of the autoimmune flare-ups associated with the climate crisis?
Well, it's interesting because I wanted to write about autoimmune disease because it affects so many, particularly women, which are affected by autoimmune diseases like lupus, arthritis. They're affected, well, and when I say arthritis, I mean rheumatoid arthritis. Women are affected by these diseases at a much greater proportion than men. And almost anecdotally, you might hear someone say, in this type of weather, my joints are aching. Or someone that has psoriasis during the winter may experience more flares. Someone with multiple sclerosis may have more flares during certain types of weather conditions like heat. In the case of lupus, it's often bright light and heat that could aggravate these conditions. So this isn't for everyone who suffers, but I did interview some experts that have studied these connections between environmental and weather conditions and flares. So if you're looking at a potential for warmer conditions, that could create more of an environment where certain people could be affected by that.
And we have a couple minutes till the next break. In your chapter, you have on heat, sleep, and memory. Can you tell us a little more about that and what pink noise is? I'd never heard the term pink noise before either.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think sleep is something that's many people are studying, and there's a lot to learn about sleep. And I mentioned that earlier that in order to sleep, we need to. I think most people recognize this. You like to have your bedroom cooler. It's easier to fall asleep when it's cooler in the room. Some people like it freezing cold, and some people just like it moderately cold. But there's a reason for that, because when our bodies are falling asleep, that's when our body temperature drops. And sleep, getting a good night's sleep, can affect cognitive performance and the ability to kind of like imagine if your brain is sorting through the memories of the day and deciding what to discard, what to keep in your long-term memory. All that happens when we're sleeping. So if you're unable to cool down at night and unable to fall asleep, then that REM part of sleep is not happening. The expert that I interviewed on this topic said that REM is sacrificed, and REM sleep is very important for our brain in many ways. But if our body is in the process of trying to cool down in a hot room, it's not doing REM sleep. See what I mean? It's really kind of interesting. It's like the body has one focus to get you to sleep and to cool down. And if it can't do that, then it can't do much else, because it's maintaining a healthy body temperature is key.
And pink noise? Did you?
Oh, right. Pink. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So pink noise is also interesting. It's a certain frequency of noise that is not white noise, and I can't tell you the exact difference because it sounds like it's a little similar, but it has been noted by scientists to be soothing to your brain and to help you to sleep. I have tried this myself, and it does work. So,
oh, good.
I was just curious. Yeah, because you can find that setting, and there is something soothing about that constant noise. I think many people use different devices to fall asleep, like a fan running or something like that. But yes, pink noise has science behind it, and that'll help you sleep.
Well, you do have a video clip on your website, Weather and Wellness, yes. Where I forget who it was, but she talked about what pink noise was, and a lot of it was the rain sound, to have the rain?
That's exactly right. Yes, it's similar to the sound of rain, and that was a professor that I interviewed for that. And yeah, so that's just to me an interesting connection to nature, because it's so soothing on a summer night to hear the rain falling, and you have the window open just a little bit, so you're getting that fresh air and you're hearing the rain. And I think that's why we like it so much when we're falling asleep, to listen to the rain. That sound is almost mimicked through that pink noise that we're talking about.
You're listening to our bold guest, Bonnie Schneider. Bonnie is a national television meteorologist and Peabody Award-winning journalist based in New York City, author of Taking the Heat, How Climate Change is Affecting Your Mind, Body, and Spirit, and What You Can Do About It. And Pettis and I would like to add you to our news group, and you may do so by texting Be Bold America at 22828. Text Be Bold America at 22828. Our list is growing, and thank you to those who've signed up. We'll be right back after this week's Hightower commentary, where Jim Hightower tells us about the plasticization of planet Earth. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
What does your toothbrush, a fish dinner, and your running shoes have in common? Plastic. We now live on planet plastic. Billions of tons of waste from everyday products made of these chemical contaminants are strewn literally everywhere, on the highest mountaintops, into the deepest seabeds, in dense tropical jungles, and all across barren deserts. It's estimated, for example, that in less than 30 years, the gross volume of discarded plastic in our oceans will outnumber fish. From grocery carryout bags to shower curtains to almost invisible bits of microplastics, the vast tonnage of this trash increases every minute, with an afterlife lasting centuries, wreaking havoc on ecosystems, destroying species, and infusing our water, air, soil, food, and us. Consider just two common products, your toothbrush and your sneakers. Until the 1930s, toothbrushes were made of degradable natural components. Since then, practically all have been throwaway plastic brushes. But there is no away, so nearly all of the trillions of brushes we've discarded in the past century are still out there, somewhere on the land or in our water. Moving from your teeth to your feet, consider that millions of sneakers are sold in the U.S. each year, advertised as being athletic and cool. What's uncool is that they're made almost entirely of melted and molded plastics that are practically impossible to recycle. So, after a short time in our closets, sneakers spend an eternity as globs of toxic plastic trash. This is Jim Hightower saying, we're being choked by our own synthetic waste, from billions of plastic bottles and cigarette filters to tons of straws and synthetic rubber tires. To help stop the insanity, contact Beyond Plastics, beyondplastics.org.
Hightower's commentaries are brought to you by the Hightower Lowdown, the monthly newsletter with Hightower's take on what Wall Street and Washington are up to. For information, visit hightowerlowdown.org.
Welcome back. You're listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the ksqd.org website. Our topic today is, Can We Take the Heat? And we're speaking with Bonnie Schneider, author of Taking the Heat and founder of Weather and Wellness. Visit weatherandwellness.com for more about what we're talking about today. And the next portion of the show, Bonnie, I wanted to talk about, because I think this is very important for everybody that has children or grandchildren. How do you talk to children about the climate crisis?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that if there may be a different view in terms of generations and how serious the topic might be approached, and that was something that I talked about in the book with experts. For example, older people that are older may not understand the passion and concern that the younger people are experiencing in terms of their fears and concerns about climate change. And the experts that I interviewed said that it's very important to listen to young people and to hear what they have to say, why they're concerned, and not be dismissive about it. That's the first thing. And the second thing that can often help is to help young people find like-minded peers to discuss their concerns about the climate and get involved in different ways, like some of the college students at the University of Washington I spoke to did. But there are also nuances in how you approach the topic depending on the age of the child. For example, one of the experts I spoke to said, I think he said it was about fourth grade, let's say, that might be the cutoff point.
Yes, it was fourth grade.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So
no tragedies before fourth grade.
I mean, God willing, right?
Right.
But I think that there is something to that. I think there's a way you can present this topic and without scaring children, making them feel that they can make a difference, and getting them involved in nature-based activities, for example. That will often help allay their fears. So in the book, I also put in some different, if younger people on social media, different sites that they could follow to get more information. I just think that in general, the more information that you have when you have a concern about something, it can be reassuring.
Well, it seems to me that there's always been the parents' talk on, the facts of life, or the birds and the bees, and we all know what that means. But I think now parents are going to need to develop the skills on facts of nature, I guess, or facts of CO2, just because it is permeating everything: school, radio shows, television, news programs. Children are very observant, and they absorb everything. And it seems to me that talking about it appropriately at each age is probably a very vital skill for parents.
I it is too, and I think it's talking about it, but also listening and asking the individuals, young people, what is their concern and why, and perhaps taking a deep dive into the science with them. If they're concerned, let's say, about natural resources, maybe talk about the water supply and how does the water come from reservoirs into our homes. I just think that there's a better. The more that's understood, the better. And then there's incredible new technologies that are happening to fight climate change, to purify water, for example. So it's of more availability and better use. And I think that it depends on the age of the young person, but showing them new technologies, and I think that might make them excited that there are innovative ideas to fight this. And on the other side of it, of course, is if they wanted to be more involved in the activism side, if they wanted to talk about policy changes and things like that. It really depends on the young person themselves and that level of concern and passion that they have and how much they want to get involved.
Well, one thing that keeps me sane, because I work on democracy and the climate crisis, two twin challenges of our times, and one thing that I keep in mind that helps my sanity is a very simple 7 Habits of Highly Effective People concept called Circle of Concern, Circle of Influence. And the climate crisis can be very in the circle of concern. You know, you hear about the water, you hear about the heat, the diseases, the this and the that, because it's so multifaceted. But when you're talking about activism, that's your circle of influence. What can you influence about that particular issue? And getting the children learning to operate from what they can do is very empowering, very proactive.
Yes, that's so true. And also on my website, weatherandwellness.com, I did a profile piece on one of these young activists that's based in Maine. And it's really interesting on how she got involved from a small town, but now she's part of an international movement of young people that are making their voices heard, which I think is incredible. You know, they're very young people. Obviously, are naturally good at knowing how to use social media and how to connect with each other. And on this particular topic, there are so many internationally that are connected and passionate about making changes.
I'll have to go back and look at that video. I looked at many, but I didn't catch that one.
It was an article.
An article on there.
Yeah.
And it's a perfect example of working from your circle of influence, you know, how she's grown that. You also have a concept about ecotherapy. What is ecotherapy?
You know, that's actually, interestingly enough, the experts I spoke to on that subject were also from California. And ecotherapy is connecting with nature, but it's therapy, but it could be therapy in that you're spending time outside and knowing and connecting with nature as a way to heal, like taking in your environment, perhaps noticing the greenery around you, noticing the wildlife. If you've ever tried to do this, I'm actually right now in Florida, and on Earth Day, which was, I guess, yesterday, our days are all blending together, but I was in Miami at this beautiful place called the Patch of Heaven Sanctuary. It's in Homestead, Florida, and they were actually doing ecotherapy in terms of a nature walk and this beautiful environment with lotus flowers floating on the water and these ancient trees and beautiful. It was just so beautiful, waterfalls. And I kind of understood it better in that environment where when you're focused on the natural beauty of nature and connecting with that is therapeutic. Now, ecotherapy is a practice of therapy. There are people that are professional ecotherapists, but I just think that in a way for people to understand it, that's part of it, is that connecting with nature. And it could be found, you know, in your own backyard or on your own street or taking a walk. You said you're on the coast, on the ocean. It's very soothing to think about that. I did that personally in New York City during the pandemic. You know, during everything was shut down. It was very cold, and I felt very isolated. So I would go, no matter what the weather was, I would go to Central Park and just notice any of the natural beauty that I could. And I found that to be very healing.
Well, there is a story in the book that I mentioned earlier in Climate Abandoned. One of the chapter authors, he wrote the chapter on ice and religion, was a minister. His name's Peter Hess. And what was interesting, I don't know if interesting is the best word or shocking, he lost not one, not two, but 3 houses in a variety of California wildfires. He lost two, I know, he lost 2 in the Sierras and lost one, his family home in Santa Rosa. Now, Santa Rosa is a big city, and in parts of it was leveled by a wildfire, and he lost, a home you wouldn't even think in an urban area, but lost that one too. And he was being a minister after all these fires, giving counseling to people, I think some kind of therapy, talking to them, dealing with this disaster that they just experienced. And then one day I asked Peter, who's giving you the therapy?
Mm-hmm.
Who gives therapy to the minister? So, the ecotherapy, I would think that people would be, after losing a home or experiencing something else of a disaster of that type, would be kind of afraid of nature. Is that something that you found?
Yeah, and I think that that's why it's actually so healing, because in the research that I did, there were people in Puerto Rico that were impacted by hurricanes there, and one of the practices that they mentioned, let's say harvesting vegetables in a garden, the language was used, trusting the earth again. So connecting with nature can allow us to trust nature again. Imagine, let's say if you're in a coastal area and there's a hurricane and there's flooding, maybe you'd have fear of being near the ocean or, because of what happened in the past, but it can be healing to face that and to trust nature again. I'm not a therapist, but this is what the therapist I interviewed told to me. Yeah.
Well, I would think when you live in an area like California, where now we get, wildfires every year, multiple, maybe even hundreds going on throughout the state, but then also areas where there are tornadoes and, every season, but they're stronger and they last longer, and, that they could be hard to trust the earth again.
Yeah, it can be. And you mentioned how you interviewed the gentleman that you said had faced multiple tragedies. And it's also interesting in my book that the professor who started this course on climate grief and eco-anxiety at the University of Washington was a California native, and her family was in Santa Barbara, and they I think at different times her mother's home or a relative's home was affected by wildfires twice within 2 years. And it really made a difference seeing, she said, young children are having to wear masks. This was pre-COVID, but they were wearing it because of wildfire smoke. So when you're in an area like California that's hit by wildfire every year after wildfire, and they're just getting more expensive and unfortunately more severe, that does produce stress and anxiety, because you don't know, is this the year that it's going to affect my home?
Well, I know Santa Barbara was affected by wildfires, and then those wildfires led to flooding later, and Montecito was a lot of Montecito was wiped out because of the flooding from the wildfires. So it gets if you're
burn areas.
Yes, if you're just joining us, our topic today is, can we take the heat? And we're speaking with Peabody Award-winning journalist Bonnie Schneider, author of Taking the Heat and founder of Weather and Wellness. Visit weatherandwellness.com. Also find Bonnie on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You're listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7 FM, Many Voices, One Station. Want a friend to hear this interview? Be Bold America is available as a podcast. Now you and your friends can listen from your favorite podcast platform, such as Apple, Google, Spotify, Radio Public, and many more. Subscribe for free. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
How do children and teens deal with war, natural disasters, and other traumatic situations? Join K-Squid Sunday at 6 p.m. for Intersections as Seth Shapiro speaks with Katie Neese, a certified child life specialist. Katie has worked in pediatric emergency rooms and supported children who are victims of natural and man-made disasters. She discusses the work she does and how her own beliefs and values motivate and inspire her to be a healing presence in children's lives. Tune into Intersections Sunday evening at 6. K-Squid, 90.7 FM and ksqd.org. KSQD, many voices, one station.
You're listening to our bold guest, Bonnie Schneider. Bonnie is the author of Taking the Heat. Now, Bonnie, in this last segment, I like to talk about keep, stop, starts, what listeners can keep doing, stop doing, start doing. But before we get into that, I still had a couple of questions. Or actually, one was a quote that I loved that you had in your book, Dr. Aaron Bernstein. His quote was, "If only climate change had a villain." What was he talking about?
Yes, because the problem with climate change is that it can often be seen as something that's a far-off, distant threat. That it doesn't. I mean, we could see wildfires burning, and we could see smoke. Let's say the haze of smoke from wildfires. But in general, a lot of times the public might view climate change as something that's far off and not an immediate threat. So if you had a face of a villain, then it's something that you could recognize, like in a movie. And I think that's what he meant. And I understand it because even writing this book, it was interesting talking to all different types of people. And many people couldn't pinpoint how climate change was affecting their health until we started talking about, well, what about wildfires and poor air quality and excessive heat and the infectious disease spread, and of course the mental health aspects. So I think that it can be difficult to see and put a face on, but it's all around us, and that's why it's important to prepare for it.
Well, I think another question I had, and I think people don't realize this is affecting them too, is the allergy season. It seems to be getting longer.
It really has, and I think it depends on, where you are in the country, but many people and so many of us are affected by different types of allergies. And mainly, I would say the majority people talk about hay fever and pollen and things like that. And what's been happening for different cities across the country, and there's been lots of research on this, is that the time in which the exposure starts to the pollen, let's say in early spring, and the time when the first frost occurs in the fall, the frost-free period has extended. So that leaves us with a longer period of time to be exposed to allergies. And I know that I suffer from allergies, and I've noticed it. I'm sure someone listening might say the same thing, that, gosh, it does seem like these allergies have been starting earlier and lasting longer, and that there is science behind that as well.
Well, and you also mentioned mold spores, and I hadn't considered that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unfortunately, mold spores, when you're dealing with one of the things that can happen from flooding, for example, where you have moisture that remains, mold spores can develop. And that's another thing that could be very tough to figure out, like say if you're affected by it, that you can see them in some parts, like if it's, gathered in one place, but not always if it's in the air. So mold is something that there's lots you can do to prevent it, and I have some quite a few tips in the book in terms of where it's found, let's say in a bathroom or any kind of moist environment. But it's important to reduce that risk too, because mold spores can also be very hazardous as well. And
another one that was in your book was talking about racial and income disparities.
Yeah, I mean this was something that came up throughout the many chapters in the book. For example, I mentioned how there's more wealth, there's more trees, and there's been lots of research on that. And I know we talked about that, but that has to do with the exposure to heat and better air quality without having those trees in place. Also, and this was something that I don't think that people knew, and this was another journalist that I quoted in the book in the Baltimore area who had done research on this, that those living in low-income communities, let's say they're living in near abandoned buildings, for example, or near open garbage, well, that attracts more insects and more disease. So just by proximity of where you live, if it's not in an area that's maintained well, because often, these large pesticide treatments can be very expensive and cost prohibitive to people. So I think it's something to keep in mind. And when it comes to heat, I interviewed a physician in Miami who was dealing with the people that lived in a neighborhood called Little Haiti, and it's an area where there's many low-income people. There's even in the heat of Florida, there's no air conditioning in some of these homes. And not only were they susceptible to heat-related illness, but she was saying that they may have a fan, not an air conditioner, but they also have the windows open, which makes sense. If you don't have air conditioning, you probably want to have the windows open. Well, unfortunately, that brings out another problem, because then the mosquitoes can come in, and that could cause more risk to health. So not having the means to protect yourself, fortunately, can lead to a host of other problems. I just want to mention one other thing, and that's affordable housing, which came up in the book as well.
Yes.
That I interviewed an excellent expert about this, and she made a very good point. You have jobs that are in the cities, so people want to live near the cities, and if they can't rely necessarily on public transportation if they live very far from the cities, so that creates a problem where you have a lot of people and not enough housing for them. And all of this, again, can lead to more exposure to the elements in the environment and climate change. And climate change and affordable housing can be very much hand in hand, unfortunately causing problems.
Oh, my. Well, you do have a lot of tips in every chapter. And in your book, you have those helpful and science-based physical and mental health care strategies. So what would some of those key strategies be? What would be some things that we can keep doing?
Well, I would say that it's very important, especially for those that are dealing with the eco-anxiety, is to keep talking about their concerns. In this course that the University of Washington offers, a lot of the assignments had to do with writing. And I found, and I also mentioned this in some videos on my website, that keeping a journal it can be very helpful to talk about your feelings about nature and about the environment. When my book was coming out in January, it was in the wintertime in the Northeast, I was thinking about it, and I wanted to create a gratitude journal where people could kind of connect with the elements of winter at the time and write about that. And I think you can do that wherever you live. And connecting with how this makes you feel. That some people, I wrote in the book a little bit about seasonal depression, and believe it or not, there are people that are suffering from this even in the end of the summer. It's not just something that happens in the winter. So the weather and our environment can affect our mood in many different ways, and I think that identifying how it affects you and writing down your feelings is something that I think all of us can do.
Well, and one keep I was thinking of, too, when you were talking earlier, and that is that people that are parents or have grandchildren or nieces or nephews, that I know that they're in tune to listening to the children, but to raise the climate crisis and these issues a little bit higher in that awareness so that you listen to those children, that it's not on the back burner. Because a lot of the climate issues are on back burners in the everyday life, and yet what's happening with children and their fears and what they hear is happening everywhere. So that just to know that that's an issue to keep listening to children for. So what should we stop doing?
Well, I think that we should stop, if this is true, and to not be dismissive of people's concerns about climate change, and not to tease them about it or something. That's not going to help anybody. But listen to people's concerns and understand that they have real concerns that should be discussed and expressed. And the reason I say this also is because some of the young people I interviewed, and gosh, from all over the country, said that in their peer groups, sometimes if they talked about their feelings, they felt that they weren't being heard. Mm-hmm. So I think I think it's important that people listen to that. And the other thing I'd say that we shouldn't be doing is ignoring the health hazards. As I mentioned in my first book, Extreme Weather, many of the people that were caught in natural disasters never checked the weather ahead of time because they might have been driving within 15 minutes of their home and didn't expect it to flood. but there are hazards that are put out in advisories. For example, air quality alerts are available, and I go into my book about how you can get that kind of information. But for example, if you're going to exercise outdoors and there's been a recent wildfire, the air might look okay to the eye, but there could be still particulate matter that could aggravate your respiratory system. And it's just important to be aware about air quality hazards, be aware about heat and how it affects you, how it might affect your children or your grandchildren if they play sports. Everybody is different in how they react to these environmental triggers, but knowing what yours are and your families and being aware of it and planning around that is something that we can do.
Well, and in California, to stop going out without a mask, I think with the wildfire smoke, we all need to start wearing masks, not just for COVID, but when the smoke, because what are they burning but houses that are, if it's houses, it's toxic material everywhere. We just have maybe 30, 45 seconds. What should people start doing?
I think people should start feeling some level of hope and optimism. Often when we talk about climate change, people feel hopeless about it. And it shouldn't be that way. There's much that can be done, whether it's with young people and their activism and getting the word out to politicians and policy. Physicians are doing that as well and communicating with each other. Meteorologists like myself are talking about the connections between these major extreme weather events and climate change when they're applicable. So I think that on every level, the more people talk about it, the better chance we have of fighting this fight and reducing the risks that change poses on our health.
Oh, Bonnie, I wish we had time. This hour flew by for me. I wanted to say one thing quickly, that you talked about soup kits in the book. So I recommend everyone to read Bonnie, because it's so practical. Bonnie, I'm so grateful that you found the time to join us on Be Bold America to talk about a vital topic for all of us. I love this conversation. You're doing great work. Thank you for being our bold and impressive guest today.
Oh, thank you, Jill, so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
It was a delight. We appreciate you and your book, Taking the Heat, How Climate Change is Affecting Your Mind, Body, and Spirit, and What You Can Do About It. It's just been an honor, and we wish you the best. And remember to visit weatherandwellness.com. It is a great resource. What's up next on Be Bold America? Well, that will be Mother's Day. On Sunday, May 8th at 5 p.m., we are going to have a special program titled, Will There Ever Be Equality for Mothers? Our guests will be Dr. Kristen Lesh and Anna Dewar-Gully, co-CEOs and co-founders of Title Equality. Title Equality is about expanding equality and inclusion by expanding democratic decision-making. They work to help organizations reduce and solve for inequities of all kinds. As mothers, they have observed how those inequalities differ among mothers from a variety of identities, backgrounds, and lived experiences. Kristen and Anna will share their landmark methodology, the equity sequence, which can help invite equity-seeking individuals from a variety of backgrounds, including mothers and parents, into the design of workplace decisions that work better for us all. So join us on Mother's Day, Sunday, May 8th at 5 p.m. to hear Will There Ever Be Equality for Mothers? Remember, Be Bold America is available as a podcast. Now you can listen to the show anytime for free, wherever you get your podcasts. I want to give a special thank you to Be Bold America's engineer, Emily Donham, to our station's program director, Howard Feldstein, and again to our bold guest, Bonnie Schneider. You're listening to KSQD Santa Cruz, Many Voices, One Station. Listen worldwide online at ksqd.org. Stay tuned for Intersections with Seth Shapiro. My name is Jill Cody, and thank you for listening to Be Bold America. Until next time, keep, stop, start,